When does mitigation outweigh aggravation? When the mitigation is the cause of the aggravation. The mental illness, the schizophrenia spectrum disorder, the psychosis is what caused James Holmes to shoot the people in the Century 16 theater. And had he not been inflicted with a disease that attacked his brain, he never would have dyed his hair orange. He never would have purchased all of those guns and all of that ammunition, and this heartbreaking tragedy would never have occurred. And nothing we do here in this case is going to turn back the hands of time. And nothing we do will bring back those who died or heal the wounds of those who were injured. For nothing can erase July 20th, 2012. And here we are at sentencing. And you'll remember, this will give you a flashback to when we did individual jury selection, and we talked a lot about this chart and how this process worked. And as you know, you've been through phase 1. You've determined that 4 aggravators were proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But now we are at phase 2. And phase 2 is about mitigation. And you know by this point what mitigation is. Mitigation is the character and background of James Holmes. It is anything that in fairness or mercy reduces his moral culpability for the crime. And it is anything that you, individually, each one of you, considers for a life sentence. Mitigation is not offered to you as an excuse or a justification or a defense to the crime. The defense part is over. That was the insanity defense, and that was the last trial, and that is over. That technical legal definition of capacity to know right from wrong, that is over. That was the last trial. Whether he goes to a psychiatric hospital, that's over. That's off the table. For you have declared him guilty, you have declared him responsible, and you have declared that he will be punished, and he will be punished. It's just which punishment he gets. And all of the evidence that you've heard about mental illness for 3 months, you can and should consider when determining whether a life sentence is appropriate in this case. You have heard testimony of family and friends of James Holmes. And you have heard from teachers and neighbors and people from the various phases of his life. And you've heard from those people for 2 reasons. Number 1, before you decide whether a man lives or dies, you have both the right and the responsibility to know everything about his life. And second, that testimony was presented to you so that you would know when he was young, he was a normal and happy young boy before the illness stole his mental health from him. He was born to Bob and Arlene Holmes. His sister was Chris. And when he was young, he laughed and played and had a lot of friends and climbed trees and dug in mud puddles and loved children and loved animals, and by all indications was a normal little boy. Never hurt anyone, never hurt animals, was obedient, by all indications, a normal little boy. And you heard that he has done things like cleanup work at the church, working at an orphanage in Tijuana, working at a camp for emotionally disadvantaged children. And those things were presented to you to show you that he is not a selfish and self-absorbed person. He was raised in the kind of family that emphasized the importance of good character, that it was important to give back to the community, to volunteer, to help, to think about other people. That is the way Bob and Arlene Holmes raised him. And when he was young, everything seemed fine. You heard from his second grade teacher, Ann Heston, who said, "The Jimmy that I had in my class was playful and exuberant." And his fifth grade teacher, Mr. Carr, said, "The Jimmy who I had in fifth grade was a smileful boy, well-balanced, had it all, popular." And that's how he was when he was young in that Oak Hills neighborhood. And all of those people came in, and they all had such vivid memories of him as this happy little boy. And they all said that they still love and support him, even if they haven't seen him for years. But as soon as the Holmes family moved back to San Diego around middle school, James Holmes began to change. He no longer went outside and played as much. He no longer had as many friends as he used to. He became introverted and stayed inside and played on the computer and didn't want to interact as much as he used to. And it was like that through middle school and high school. And you heard from friends from that era, and he had some friends, and they would play cards at lunch and maybe go out. But through middle school and high school, the friends that he said the closest to him were at his house one time in all those years. That is in such stark contrast to how he was when he was younger. And in high school, you heard from the track coach who called him a shadow, sort of a shadow person in the group, because he was never in the group. He was always just outside the group, to the point where he had trouble taking a group picture for the track team. And you heard from a couple of the high school teachers who say, I'm the kind of teacher who really gets to know my students. So for me not to know him better, that says something. That tells you how much he worked not to socialize, or else I would know more about him. But by all indications, he was a good student. He was polite. He was never mean or rude, all through high school. Not a negative complaint about him. And all this progressive introversion that you heard about is the beginning of the schizophrenia affecting him, the prodromal phase, the starting of the illness. And he goes to college, University of California at Riverside, and you hear some more of the same. His friends and roommates there say, he was nice, but we had to sort of drag him out to go out with us. Had to sort of drag him, pull him along to do things. And after he got to know him a little bit, it got a little bit better, but he was not the kind to say, hey guys, let's go out to dinner, let's go do something. They had to pull him. Again, an example of this introversion, the beginning of this schizophrenia beginning to affect him. And after he graduates from college, he decides he wants to apply to graduate school. And he sends out 5 or 6 applications to graduate schools, and you heard that no one even interviewed him. Despite his grades and his good GRE score, no one agreed to interview him. And that was disappointing and that was frustrating. But did he act out by hurting people or lashing out or acting in anger? He had absolutely no history of acting violently in response to frustration or disappointment. And when he did not get into graduate school, he decided to move back in with his parents, and again, very reclusive, sleeping a lot, playing video games. And his mom said, like most moms would, you need to get up and you need to go get a job. And you heard that he worked at that pill factory. And that woman who came in and testified, Tara Fournier, and she told you that she has 2 sons. One has Asperger's and one suffers from autism. And she said that when she interacted with James Holmes, it reminded her of her sons, that there was something just not right with him. He would stare straight through her, and he was not present when she was interacting with him. And those 2 guys he worked with said that he would stare up into the corner as if he was seeing something and make a weird facial expression. And it was more than just being shy, that there was something wrong. He does another round of applications for graduate school, and this time he gets accepted into the University of Colorado at Denver, and so he moves to Denver. And this is really important to him. He really wants this to work, and he commits himself that he's going to try and make this social aspect of school work. And when he begins, it goes okay for a while. This young woman named Gargi asks him out, and he begins a relationship that's important to him. And he has a couple friends who he hangs out with. And for a while, it's going okay. And in the classes where all he has to do is read and take notes and take tests, and he can sort of do it by himself, he does fine. But when you add a social component to that, the lab work, where you have to work with the other people in the lab, or the presentations where you have to stand in front of a group and talk, his social anxiety was getting to the point where he could not do those things. And that is why his schoolwork began suffering. He could not do the social aspect that graduate school required. And by the time he got to June of 2012, he could not do the final oral exam, and by that point he was so sick, he was just sort of off the track. But neuroscience was important to him, and you heard from Arlene Holmes that he decided when he was 14 years old to go into neuroscience. And that's because he knew that his mind was broken. Something was wrong with it. And if he went into neuroscience, maybe he could fix it. And if he could fix his own mind, then he wouldn't have to tell anyone about these awful thoughts that he was having. And if he could fix it, he wouldn't have to suffer the embarrassment of the stigma of mental illness. And so he went to neuroscience to figure it out, and he got on the internet trying to figure out what was wrong with his brain, because he wanted help, but he didn't want anyone to know. And that was his dilemma. Mental illness can strike like cancer. Without regard to your background, without regard to your status in life, without regard to how intelligent you are. And when James Holmes was born, he had this psychotic mental illness in his blood, in his DNA. He had a paternal grandfather with a psychotic mental illness. He had a maternal grandfather with a psychotic mental illness. And he has an aunt who has suffered from schizoaffective disorder, a psychotic illness. For 30 years, she's been disabled by this illness. And so when mental illness runs through this family, and when James Holmes was born, he got it. And so from the beginning, it was in his DNA. In the spring of 2012, when he was at graduate school, he began to recognize that he was losing the battle of this turmoil going on in his head. He began to realize that. And so he thought he needed to seek some help finally. And he voluntarily, on his own, made an appointment at the University Mental Health Center, and he went to see a psychiatrist. And the moment he walked in, he tells them he has thoughts of killing people. And he has 7 more appointments with a psychiatrist, and each and every time he tells them he has thoughts of killing people up to 3 to 4 times a day. And no, he doesn't tell them the date or when it's going to happen, but he tells them he's having these thoughts. And he's ambivalent. He wants Dr. Fenton to help him, but he doesn't. He feels like he needs to complete this mission, but he wants someone to stop him. And that is because he is sick. He is having these thoughts because he is sick. But there are moments where he is hoping someone will recognize it. Perhaps when he says, I'm thinking about having thoughts of killing people, that someone will do something to stop him because he can't control it anymore. And you've heard that on March 21st, he was prescribed sertraline. And you have in evidence the paperwork that was found in Mr. Holmes's apartment about the prescription sertraline. And on the paperwork that came with the prescription, it's an emergency if after taking that medication you begin acting on dangerous impulses. If you begin acting aggressive or violent, that these are the possible side effects of that medication. And if he begins the medication on March 21st, within 4 to 5 days, March 25th, he's telling Gargi for the first time about this human capital delusion within 5 days of starting that medication. And he wrote in his notebook, and he told Dr. Metzner, as soon as I took that medication, I lost all fear. Things began to happen in super speed. He began describing manic symptoms after starting that medication, and he felt that it may have made his symptoms worse. And the sertraline is increased once, and the sertraline is increased again, and shortly thereafter, he begins to order guns and ammunition and ballistic gear and handcuffs and tear gas canisters and road stars and stuff that is completely and absolutely out of character for James Holmes. Spending all of his money on this gear that he, prior to that time, had absolutely no interest in. And he began to prepare for what he called a mission to increase his human capital, and that mission took over his friendships, that mission took over his education, that mission took over his life. Now, you have heard testimony from a lot of experts who believe that Mr. Holmes was mentally ill. And we've put together a chart of the experts. Dr. Gurr, Dr. Metzner, Dr. Reed, Dr. Woodcock. Those are the 4 doctors who examined and evaluated Mr. Holmes. All 4 say serious mental illness. 3 of the 4 say delusional, and even Dr. Reed says, well, I'm leaning toward that it's a delusion. All 4 say psychotic. All 4 diagnose him with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. And all 4 say that it's either like the but-for cause or the direct result of the shooting was the mental illness. And you heard from Dr. Metzner on Monday of this week, but you heard from Dr. Reed months ago. So I wanted to remind you what he said about the mental illness's involvement in this shooting. And he was asked the question, is it your opinion, sir, that absent his mental condition, we wouldn't all be here, would we? And Dr. Reed said, that's a true statement. And he was asked, this crime would never have taken place without the mental illness. And Dr. Reed said, that's true, in my opinion, yes. And Dr. Reed said, I believe there is a substantial relationship between the presence of the mental illness and the eventual carrying out of the event. Those are the doctors appointed by the court, saying that but for this mental illness, that shooting would never have occurred. There's evidence that Mr. Holmes was mentally ill before, during, and after July 20th of 2012. Evidence that he was mentally ill before July 20th, the meetings with Dr. Fenton. Now, you have her records and her reports and evidence. If you want to look at those, go look at those. But they indicate her belief and worry that he was on the verge of a psychotic break. And the notebook. The notebook was from before July 20th, and you can look at that. Dr. Fenton and Dr. Feinstein, these are some of the things pulled out of their notes and their reports. That Mr. Holmes glances around the room in an odd way. He's odd and bizarre, paranoid, the starting of a nervous breakdown. That stuff that existed before July 20th, 2012. And that notebook, the writings in the notebook, the first half of that notebook is just disorganized thoughts. It does not make sense. It's the writings of a psychotic person. Why do persons commit to zero or negative infinity? All men are created equal, and all men are uncreated equal, but in between there is inequality. That is the writings of a psychotic person, and he does that for pages, and then he applies that psychotic level of thinking to this psychotic plan that he comes up with about the theater. And that is all before July 20th, 2012. Evidence that he is psychotic during the shooting. You have those pictures. Does that look like a neuroscience graduate student to you, or does that look like someone who is in the middle of their first psychotic break? Does this apartment look like the apartment of a neuroscience graduate student, or does this apartment look like someone who is in the middle of their first psychotic break? And when he's arrested for shooting multiple people, and he's taken to the interrogation room, and he's doing this strange thing under the table, and then he sits up, and then he does the strange thing under the table, and they put the bags on his hands, and he's doing this. That is not an appropriate reaction for the situation. If you are arrested for murder and taken to the police station, that is not the appropriate reaction. That is the reaction of a schizophrenic person who is psychotic. And after he's put in the jail, after his arrest, and he's still writing that galactic colonization writing that he's doing, the symbol, that symbol that you've seen, that symbol was on his calendar in his apartment. That symbol was in the notebook. And he keeps that symbol in his jail cell. And he says that it's the ultraception. All perspectives at once, and not and every. All thoughts at once. All space and for times at once. All contradictions at once. Everything, every action, every descriptor all in one. Most simplified, the complete every all as an ultimate conception. Problem of unconceivable, conceivable, the paradox. That makes no sense. That is evidence of his psychosis. And then in November of 2012, when he becomes obviously and floridly psychotic, and can you imagine what it must have took for the jail to call for an ambulance twice for him? You know, they have medical facility, they have doctors and nurses and a medical unit, but he was so sick, they called for an ambulance to take him to the hospital twice. And he ends up in the hospital, and he tells the doctor, you watched this video, where he thinks that shadows are after him, and he is trying to hide under the blankets while 4 points strapped to the bed. And you saw his struggle to try and get under the blankets because he's scared of something that's not there. Because he is psychotic. And that's why they gave him Haldol. And it's helped him. And he has remained on that because it helped him because he's psychotic. We called Dr. Metzner to testify on Monday of this week. And we called him to testify, and I borrowed these slides from Mr. Brockler's first closing after the first trial, because it describes Dr. Metzner was handpicked by the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo. He was appointed by the court. He is forensically trained and certified. He did not change his practice to suit anyone in this case. He's board certified in forensic psychiatry. He's done 1 to 200 sanity evaluations before. Court appointed 80% of the time in those cases. He's worked for both the defense and the prosecution. He's reviewed all records and reports in the case. He called everyone, including Doctors Woodcock, Hanlon, and Gurr. He's worked hundreds of hours reviewing the case, 120 plus page report, did a detailed job and report, got corroboration for things that he looked at, did a detailed analysis, and he gave a clear opinion. And you will recall that his opinion was that Mr. Holmes is mentally ill. Now, he said that he could distinguish between right or wrong, but make no mistake about it, he said that he is seriously mentally ill. And you have Dr. Metzner's resume, his CV, back in evidence. If you want to look at it and see if you think that he's qualified, whether or not Mr. Holmes is mentally ill. But we called him to tell you again, and we called him because he wasn't hired by us. He never met us before. He had never met us until this case. He was appointed by the Mental Health Institute on behalf of the court. And we asked him about whether James Holmes was mentally ill. And Dr. Metzner told you, but for the psychosis, the shooting would never have happened. That the shooting was a direct result of the mental illness. That people don't choose to be mentally ill, and they don't choose the content of their delusions. That Mr. Holmes' judgment was impaired like that of someone who was intoxicated or like that of someone who has Alzheimer's disease. Yeah, he can make decisions, but the decisions he makes are tainted by the mental illness. And the choices he makes are tainted by the mental illness. And that schizophrenia spectrum disorder can cause inappropriate emotional response, inappropriate emotional numbing. And that there were triggers to Mr. Holmes' psychosis, breaking up with his girlfriend, not doing as well in school as he would have liked, were stressors or triggers which triggered the psychosis, and then the psychosis caused him to be delusional and come up with this plan to shoot people in the theater. And no one has said that Mr. Holmes is malingering or feigning or faking or exaggerating psychiatric symptoms. No one. It is undisputed that he is seriously mentally ill. Prosecution has tried to come up with other motives for this shooting. And it makes sense when something tragic and senseless like this happens, you try and come up with an explanation for it. You try to understand it. And this case in particular was so random and so senseless. But the mere senselessness of it shows that it's psychotic. There was no political statement or religious statement or statement of any kind to be made by what happened at that theater. All it was James Holmes and that delusion about human capital. He was not trying to send the media some grand statement about anything. He is not the kind of person who seeks notoriety. He's not looking for attention. He's never looked for attention. He did not send anything to the New York Times or to the Denver Post. He sent his notebook to his psychiatrist. And he told Dr. Reed several times this had nothing to do with notoriety.
Was that part of the way you wanted to be remembered as of May, June, July of 2012?
I didn't think of that back then.
Tell me about being remembered and how you thought about or may have thought about being remembered in April, May, June, July of 2012.
I don't know how to answer that.
How'd you want to be remembered?
I don't remember that being a reason at the time.
A reason for what?
A reason for doing the shooting was to be remembered. I don't remember that at the time of the shooting, that being a factor coming into play.
Is it important to you to be remembered? Let me rephrase that. At the time, was it important to James Holmes to be remembered?
I don't know if I came up with that at the time, or if I analyzed what all the pictures were.
It was not about notoriety. It was not about hatred. It was about the delusion. And although Mr. Holmes is medicated and he's stable, Dr. Metzner told you he remains and will always suffer from schizophrenia because the medication doesn't cure schizophrenia. What it does is that it sort of tamps down those positive symptoms, but it is less effective on negative symptoms and on delusions. And so Mr. Holmes has the negative symptoms of, he's sort of just introverted into himself. And then you add the antipsychotic medication on top of that, and one of the negative symptoms is the inappropriate emotional response. And you have watched him during this trial. We have all watched him during this trial, because think of all the testimony that we've heard in the last 3 months, and we look at him and we look for a reaction and we look for a response, and there is rarely, if ever, a response from him at all to any of this. Because that is the illness, that is the inappropriate emotional reaction, the inappropriate emotional numbing, and on top of that, the medication. And that is the illness. But what those medications do for him, they keep him from wanting to ram his head into a wall. And they keep him from thinking that his food is poisoned, and that keeps him from smearing feces and licking the walls and all of the things, those positive symptoms that have affected him. And so he takes that medication faithfully. The question boils down to, does the mitigation outweigh the aggravation? Does the mental health mitigation and the other mitigation, is it enough to outweigh aggravation such that a life sentence is appropriate in this case? And if you decide that mitigation does outweigh aggravation, or if you're unsure whether mitigation outweighs aggravation, but if you decide it does or you're not sure, now is the time to say so. Now is the time to say so. You give the word, and this ends with a life sentence. Thank you. The fact that his family supports him, the fact that he's never been in trouble, he went 24 years never getting in trouble. And you heard the testimony of his parents and his sister, and you can judge for yourself the sincerity of their testimony, and that they care and love him and will always visit him and always write to him, and that he is important to them. And the law tells you that at this phase, each one of you decides mitigation for yourself. What is mitigation for you may or may not be mitigation for you. You may value mitigation differently than you value mitigation, and the law says that's okay, that's what you're supposed to do here. Unlike that first trial, unlike aggravation, this is up to you as an individual to make a moral determination about what value you assign to this mentally ill man's life. You know a lot about the James Holmes from 2011 and 2012, and now you know a lot about the James Holmes before that mental illness robbed his future and his reality and replaced it with this tragedy. I've heard the prosecution ask, yes, maybe he's mentally ill, but did it affect his functioning? Well, if smearing feces and licking the wall and turning somersaults with a cup on your penis, if that is not mental illness that affects your functioning, what is? And if throwing away all your personal relationships and throwing away all the hard work you did in school and amassing this arsenal of weapons with your money for this plan to increase your human capital by killing a bunch of people you've never met before, if that is not a mental illness that has affected your functioning, then what is? The way it appeared on July 20th is the way it appears 3 years later. He is mentally ill. He is obviously mentally ill. And if you decide that mitigation outweighs aggravation, if you decide that that devastating and serious mental illness was enough to outweigh that mitigation because it caused it, that aggravation because it caused it, you need to tell your foreman, I've given this careful consideration. I have seriously considered everything that I've heard and seen. But for me, in my heart, and in my soul, mitigation outweighs aggravation, and the foreman may agree with you, or he may think differently, but nonetheless, he will respect your decision, and he will sign his name on Section 2 of those verdict forms. He will bring that decision back into this courtroom, and then James Egan Holmes will live the rest of his life in a prison cell.